Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Gilliland. I am one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks. With me to discuss the return of the Mandalorian in season 3 is Stephen Tolafield and Thomas Harper, and that's in order that they signed in on Zoom. So, everyone, starting with Stephen, how you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. It's so great to live in such an era of Star Wars coming out of every television screen I have in my home, and it being a different story. It's amazing. So I'm feeling really happy.
And Thomas, how about you?
Look, you blame Zoom and our sign in for this obvious bias towards Steven. And you could just come right out. It's okay. I prefer Steven over myself. So that's okay. No, Steven took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, you two new episodes of Star Wars in the same day. I got up off the couch after Mandalorian was over and was like, nope, sit back down. There's more Bad Batch. So quite a time.
Yeah, we are extremely fortunate to live in this era, a golden age that there's a series a quarter. This is fantastic. We're so lucky. Again, if the 8-year-old me would not believe this world that we live in. So it is so good. I think they're at the right pace, not too much, not too little. Like if it's like, hey, we wait 3 years between seasons, it's like between seasons 1 and 2 of Carnival Row was the pandemic. You kind of lose your momentum when that happens. This is just right. And whether it's there's a lot to enjoy as we get this once a quarter. So all good stuff. But now, before we get into the meat of this episode, and I'm not talking about alligator meat, I'm talking about something else that you would see in Florida. And Stephen, you went to the Galactic Star Cruiser. Tell us, what was it like getting to fulfill your 9-year-old dreams?
It's on some level, I'm just speechless about it because it was so great. But then, like as I was saying, I will not shut up about it if you wind me up to talk about it. It was so great, and gosh, they just really got it right in making you feel like it's your story or you're a part of the story in ways that I just didn't expect. I tend to be kind of a wallflower in really big groups, and I didn't really expect to get involved as closely as I did, but I found myself like kind of right in the middle of the action, like helping some very major characters. And it was so cool and so interesting, and we just had a great time. And my husband is a Star Wars fan, but he's not sort of as deeply into it as I am. But he had a great time. He was really into the First Order stuff. I think to kind of to antagonize me. But
I like that.
To be fair, like the First Order kind of contact that you work with was hilarious and super campy and really fun, and so I definitely got the appeal. And last thing I'll say is that we met a bunch of people on the excursion or the trip that were there for like the second or third time, and
Wow.
So it's not that I'm necessarily planning on doing more excursions with it, but it's definitely, there's like replayability to it. You can do so many things, and it's so rich. And there was a couple of storylines that I just didn't even get to see because I was busy doing other ones. So it's really, really cool. I'd highly recommend if you can swing it.
Well, there's a group going with Coffee with Kenobi in I think June.
Nice.
So I'm sure they will have a rip-roaring good time. And I see the attraction of going with a bunch of friends to go. It's like we saw your costumes. Your husband was into it.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to do something
awesome.
awesome for his birthday. So
no, it was
good
great.
luck.
Yeah, and
good luck planning.
And I'll say we were there with a bunch of other people who, we met them there, but they were all planning on doing kind of it wasn't like an adults only thing, but they were trying to do it more of like a adult focused costuming excursion. So they were going to try to buy out the Halcyon with a bunch of people who are just really into the cosplay and making it sort of an adult trip. And so yeah, people are definitely doing the group thing.
Nice.
Very cool.
I mean, going to a Star Wars event without kids just seems wrong. I just
but because
I have kids and I go to Star Wars events all the time without them.
right, but there's gambling on the Halcyon with like the
that's
sabacc. I mean, it's fake gambling, but we were playing sabacc with like 12-year-olds who were beating us, and it was just weird to be in a bar gambling with like kids, which is but it was
Check their wrist for one of those little Lando devices.
exactly.
Yeah, in real life, you're going to prison.
Totally.
So like that's
And then Chewbacca wanders in and like is helping to get. It's so cool. It's great.
that does sound pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm just trying to imagine it. Just being able to immerse yourself into that adventure and go have fun with a bunch of friends. That does sound pretty cool.
It's basically an adrenaline rush for two straight days. It was great.
Yeah, I'm talking about kids in Star Wars. When my cousin, who's a year younger, he's an ER doctor. We went to go see Rogue One together when it premiered. And we were doing the planning. I said, shouldn't we take your sons? And his reaction was, no, I see them all the time. And I was like, but I don't. I feel bad.
I feel that very deeply.
I mean, I got over it. We had a great time. It's like I kind of want to take the nieces and nephews for that sort of thing, because they might have a happy memory of me that lasts their entire lives. Maybe I want to be associated as the fun uncle.
Right.
Ted, can you just go home? We stay with Uncle Josh.
He's fun. But speaking of fun and dads, we're back to the Mandalorian, and the opening scene is it's the children of the Watch. They're doing a religious indoctrination or confirmation of a youth into the, I don't know, covert. And it made me wonder, is this a religion or a cult? And I want to get your guys' take before we jump into all the law. Stephen?
That's a good question. I think that when I think of cults, I think of like RICO type things where there's unlawful things happening, kind of an organized crime type thing that is sort of clothed in the affects of a religion or sort of a metaphysical belief. But I'm not sure that that this seems more to me like a very fundamentalist religion that is certainly not very tolerant of other belief systems, but it seems like it would be maybe on the very, very close side of the line between cult and religion for me on the religion side.
Thomas, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Bo-Katan certainly thinks that it's a cult. So one of the other prominent members, or last remaining prominent members of a very distinguished Mandalorian family. And it sounds like in universe, amongst the folks that know the Watch, that's how they regard them. And it's almost sort of this ultra orthodox sect. And the intersectionality I see here, just in terms of what we talk about, is it's clearly an organization or a sect that enforces its own rules. They sort of have like their own version of canon law, if you're familiar with that within the Catholic Church. The whole quest that he's on right now to absolve himself and get off this apostate status is emblematic of that. These self-enforced, self-created laws, like little L laws. But from time to time, they do need to take advantage of sort of the larger, bigger L, big L system of laws. And you see that all the time in our world as well, whether it's a religious type sect or what. I think in my area of Pennsylvania, the Amish are very big, and so it's a very cloistered sect of folks, but oftentimes they have to make use of traditional civilian law enforcement. Look no further than this incident with George Santos, that representative out of New York that's caught headlines, and the business that he had with allegedly stealing some puppies from them. And there you had this cloistered sect that had to bring in outside law enforcement and make use of laws like that. So that's how I viewed them from the very get-go. But they don't make butter, so that's and they don't seem to make their own
Cheese.
furniture either, so that's disappointing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with whether or not this is a cult or a religion. They don't seem to be into checking for head injuries, so there's no concussion protocol. So that seems like a big red flag. Similar to, I have family members who are Christian Scientists, which is, we believe in the power of prayer as opposed to the practice of medicine. I don't agree with their beliefs, and because there were instances with kids dying from the lack of treatment of like a ruptured bowel or something horrible. So you do get, hey, this is our belief, and we're not going to engage in a CT scan after someone gets launched into a rock by a giant alligator turtle because we don't believe in removing the helmet. It's like, you probably should scan that guy's brain to make sure that he doesn't have a concussion and that you treat the concussion. Or does everyone just have bad haircuts? Like, there's a lot to unpack there. But Black's Law Dictionary 10th edition for iOS devices defines religion as a faith system and worship, usually involving belief in a supreme being and usually containing a moral or ethical code, such as a system recognized and practiced by a particular church, sect, or denomination. In construing the protections under the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, courts have interpreted the term religion broadly to include the wide variety of theistic and non-theistic beliefs. Well, we're getting into non-theistic because they don't seem to believe in a supreme being, at least none's been mentioned so far. It's been a code of conduct. Before jumping into some case law, do either of you have any comments to add to that definition?
Yeah, it seems like the Mandalore is kind of a messianic figure, at least in their code. They're always trying to achieve the purest form of his way. So yeah, I agree that there's maybe not a higher being or creator that's behind the belief system, but it certainly does seem to be that there's a person that they either sort of approach worshiping if they don't actually worship him.
It's almost, yeah, it's the persona of their ideal version of what a Mandalorian should be. And it's interesting because you have a very big schism between say their sort of clear code and whatnot and those of, say, House Kryze and I don't know, the more modern, the more mainstream Mandalorians, if we can call them that. Look no further than the symbology of the Darksaber. That seems to hold a tremendous amount of value, certainly with the more mainstream Mandalorians, but doesn't hold that same sway across all sects. So it's a really interesting culture. This is like an aspect of this show that I'm most happy that they've delved into. They've leaned fully into the Mando culture and that exploration.
Well, let's jump into some case law with this. And this is from Alvarado v. City of San Jose, 94 Federal 3rd, 1223 at 1227. It's a Ninth Circuit case from 1996. Attempting to define religion in general and for the purposes of the Establishment Clause is notoriously difficult, if not impossible, task. Citations, and then a quote, Few tasks that confront a court require more circumstance than that of determining whether a particular set of ideas constitutes a religion within the meaning of the First Amendment. There's more. While there's no question that culti, which I believe, yes, which is from Q the Winged Serpent, for another deep cut for nerd love, was at one time a religious figure, the parties agree that for First Amendment purposes, a symbol must have current religious adherence to be considered religious. Not surprisingly, there are no cases holding that a religious belief must be current to merit protection under the Free Exercise Clause or potentially violate the Establishment Clause. Free exercise cases generally involve claims brought by individuals or groups claiming to belong to a recognizable religion. Establishment cases usually, though not always, involve well-known religions because they are most likely to generate the dangers the clause is designed to prevent. So, a lot there, and that can cross into things like New Age and Mormon writings as well for, is it a religion? And this is definitely a faith system. People are living by a creed. You know, Mormons were considered a cult in the early days before, they weren't considered one. So it is a really complicated, weird question. And if you get into, the Protestant Reformation, you could see that Catholics weren't exactly thrilled with Martin Luther and all of the early Protestants that formed. So again, sticky topic, easy for people to start a war over, and bricks thrown through windows. So again, people can get very upset when you talk about their faith system. So not that that would ever happen in the United States today. Now, I believe, Thomas, you added some additional thoughts here about First Amendment or religious freedom for the Mandalorians.
That was probably Stephen, but
That was me, yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
It occurred to me that if they were a religion, that some of their practices seem to be a little dangerous or potentially unlawful. Specifically, it struck me that baptizing or conducting an initiation ceremony in a pool of water in which kaiju live seemed a little child endangery to me. And of course, when religions or people who are practicing religions commit crimes, or because, for example, the famous example is using peyote in sort of native religions. The government might prosecute people for conduct that is integral to the practice of their religion or their spirituality. And these sorts of questions raise the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a federal statute from the 90s that makes all burdens on religious practice, even if they're facially neutral applications of facially neutral laws, subject to strict scrutiny to make sure that the government is not sort of limiting or burdening people's expression, even if the law that they're invoking is facially neutral. So I was wondering if the government would be limited by the RFRA from prosecuting the armorer for child endangerment for putting that child in that situation with the giant monster. To defend against the prosecution, the government would have to establish that the prosecution was to advance a compelling state interest and that it was narrowly tailored to avoid overburdening religious expression. And of course, when children are involved, governments have a lot of leeway to protect children. So it seems like the government might be able to prosecute her for violation of California's Californian child endangerment statute. But the only thing I'll add is that because of City of Bernie, that famous U.S. Supreme Court case, the RFRA is only the federal government. It doesn't apply to states. And many states have their own religious freedom restoration acts, but California is not one of them. Actually, we don't have a RFRA here in California. So so maybe they would be able to prosecute her without regard for a strict scrutiny standard for potentially burdening the armorer's religion. Just struck me as interesting.
I'll add, I did a little research on this for Halloween topics and covering the 1932 The Mummy, on whether or not the trying to resurrect a corpse, if that would run afoul of the free exercise clause. And the issue there was laws of general applicability, you know, those don't infringe upon religion. Like, that's not a defense. Like, which in the Mummy's case, it was breaking and entering and then committing arson, not protected. I think the same argument could be made for some of the actions that are being done with a youth, with like, you will never take off your helmet. We will never treat you for a head injury. You know, there's a lot there that could get weird fast. Now, did they know a giant kaiju lived there? So like, this gets into a foreseeability issue and whether or not it's actually negligent conduct.
Yeah, but there's an interesting delineation, because we don't know how long they've been on this planet. They're living in a cave of all things, so they're not exactly well established. But I think get beyond the initial, attack of this creature, and you see that they stand and fight. And I would argue that the conscious decision of the covert to do that was tied in maybe a religious practice that just part of it. We know that at least from Mando, that carrying weapons openly, that's part of their religion. Certainly this connection to this sort of warrior culture and this belief in not retreating could be an offshot of that. And so that in and of itself, I think, could pose an interesting question for the law there. So forget foreseeability, whether you did or didn't know that creature existed, but you did have an opportunity to retreat and get that child or the children back to safety in the cave, and you didn't do that by virtue of your religious practice or belief.
Yeah, they are running a horrible orphanage. Like, well, I mean, like, we thought the one that Han grew up in was bad. This is a different level of bad. So at least there seems to be caring adults there that want all the children to be safe. Living in the cave would not pass a health and wellness check, like, for being in the best interest of the children to be living in those conditions. None of that seems okay if Child Protective Services came in and went, where's the running water? How do they eat? What do you mean they have to wear helmets all the time? Like this, and it's now gun safety in children. There's a lot to be said for kids raised with guns safely is perfectly legitimate. Like, if they're taught, all gun safety requirements that are best practices with, don't keep a gun loaded, keep the ammo separate. There are rural places where teaching kids about guns is perfectly fine. Suburbs is a different story. Like, there's a different levels of care that you could get into, let alone leaving a weapon out that a kid could get their hands on, and thus cause a very unfortunate accident, which would raise parental liability. So if they have all been, basically, if they're foundlings and they're rebuilding their covert, and by taking in orphans and teaching them about guns, and then they nearly get eaten by the giant alligator turtle, I could see Child Protective Services not handling this well.
I would pay good money to watch a Annie sort of parody based on It's a Hard Knock Life for foundlings. All the drama that the orphans have to go through. And
I hope there's a parody someplace that they did that. Like that would just be.
would love that.
It's all right, everyone. We're done for the day. Now, positions 5, 6, 7. Yeah,
I can also imagine the interview between protective services and like the armor, where all of the answers are just, "This is the way." Thank you for your time. This has been very helpful.
Let me guess, this is the way.
What do you feed them? They all eat alone. Like,
We got a big dead alligator out there. We got plenty of food.
yeah, it's like they're going to be okay food wise for a while. I mean, they have to prep it and salt it, dry it. I mean, there's a lot that they can do, but again, there's no refrigeration. So again, this is very Little House on the Prairie style prepping the food. Yeah, so much issues there. Well, now let's get to the topic that I believe has caused the most odd feelings amongst other podcasters, and that's trying to revive IG-11 and whether or not trying to rebuild him cheapens his sacrifice or changes it in some way from a droid. And my reaction was like, wait, that's his actual head. So this wasn't an artist that built a statue of him. They found leftovers and built a statue around that as a monument to him. Well, that raises the question, was it desecration of a corpse to use IG-11's head and arm in a monument? And pulling from Mississippi law on what is desecration of a corpse, because there's a rich body of case law out there. Every person who shall knowingly and willfully dig up, except as otherwise provided by law, obliterate, or in any way desecrate any cemetery where human dead are interned, are caused through word, deed, or action the same to happen, shall upon conviction be imprisoned for not more than 1 year in the county jail, or fined not more than $500, or both, in the discretion of the court. We don't like corpses being messed with. For IG-11's case, the thermal detonator went off, vaporized a whole bunch of stormtroopers, apparently vaporized most of his body, and the head and shoulders and one arm went flying off in one direction, didn't land in lava, as is eventually found. They don't bury him, they turn him into a monument. Thomas, what's your reaction to that?
Well, let's set aside the human remains, like the easy sort of entry issue. We'll treat IG-11 as a human for our purposes here, and to me, he is. But I think the key is we're talking about the word desecrate, right? So that has a negative connotation in it. The idea is that they have been laid to rest in a place that ideally aligns with their wishes and their will, or however that was determined, and you have disturbed that, and that's where that desecration comes from. You've gone in and upset the balance, so to speak. It's not desecration to exhume a corpse for lawful reasons. So there are all sorts of ways that you can lawfully dig up a body that's been buried. But traditionally, when we talk about like interring humans, we really want to honor the intent of that person. And frequently, I'll compare IG-11 to sort of battlefield heroes, right? It is not uncommon for battlefield heroes not to be made into a statue in which their remains are encased, but you see a lot of statues where the fallen leader, the fallen hero, is interred underneath it or in the sarcophagus, right? Somewhere in there. And that's been part of their wish, or that's how their family has executed things. It's unclear for what IG-11's thoughts on that would have been, but I have to imagine that his ultimate purpose at the end of his life, what we thought was the end of his life, was to protect the child. He was executing that mission, and to be honored for that sacrifice, even if it meant having his body sort of incorporated within that memorial, I think that falls on the side of a positive use of his remains and not one that would qualify for desecration.
Stephen, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm sort of consistent with Thomas's impulse here, because it's very uncommon, but there are examples of sort of heroes or political leaders having their corpses on public display. Like, you could go to Red Square and see Vladimir Lenin in the flesh, in this very weird preserved thing. And that's, we wouldn't necessarily think of that as a desecration of his corpse. Similarly, like Jeremy Bentham, who's like a English philosopher and social reformer, he and sort of piggybacking on what Thomas mentioned about sort of wishes and intent and sort of the preservation of a body after death, but his wish was that his body be used in dissection for medical students to train them on anatomy, but then to thereafter preserve his body. And you could still go to the University College of London and see Jeremy Bentham. Like, his body, his head is no longer real, it's cast in wax. But perhaps folks who are going to Star Wars Celebration might want to check out Jeremy Bentham's preserved corpse.
Fun side trip.
Yeah. The connection is here. Legal Geek Star Wars.
You can thank us later.
So for Lenin, there were early Soviets that thought they would be able to resurrect Lenin,
Right.
and that he would walk Red Square. So I took a Russian history course in college, and it was like, whoa, that is really out there.
Speaking of cults.
Yeah. Okay, well, it was the state was replacing religion. That's what they had wanted. But the Lincoln Memorial doesn't have Lincoln in it.
Right.
Okay. Now in Washington, D.C., they did want to intern President Washington under the Capitol, but his will was very clear that his corpse was to be buried in Virginia until the end of time. And I think his will actually says something along those lines. And since that hasn't happened yet, his will controlled on where his remains would stay, which is why there's a crypt for him under the Capitol that never got used. But it's like the skull in the jar on display, but it would be in the public square. I mean, Lenin might be the closest analogy to it. It's way out there.
It's very uncommon, for sure. It's very unusual.
But since he's a droid and the rules of biology don't apply to him,
right?
Does that mean there was a duty to treat him after they found his severed head and shoulders? Now, the duty to treat laws, they mostly exist for hospitals. And there's a duty for hospitals to provide emergency care to those present at the hospital. And if an emergency medical condition exists, the hospital must either treat the medical condition to stabilize the emergency or transfer the patient to another medical facility. If a droid gets blown up, is there a medical emergency? Is there a time limit on what the window is to save him or it, or however it identifies by gender? That's just different. We've seen R2 get blown up dead in the Clone Wars, and they found him floating in space and they rebuilt him. Also in A New Hope, he does take Vader's shot to the head. So like R2, has taken some ugly hits as well that look like end of life type situation. I feel weird about IG-11 being resurrected, but I also really like IG-11. I felt we didn't get enough time with him. So again, I have very mixed feelings on this, on whether or not it cheapens the sacrifice. Either of you want to add to that?
I just want him back so he can quote more subparagraphs from the Bondsman Guild Protocol. I mean, that's my selfish legal desire.
That's your love language, is like subsections.
Bring it. Bring it. Long form citations, please.
Well, and so when he comes back online and the default programming kicks in, it looked like very Sam Raimi Evil Dead, with him crawling across the floor, almost stop motion animation. And I don't know if either of you caught that or saw it differently, but it looked stop motion to me, and it looked old school horror movie.
It looked like the first Terminator movie when it
yeah. That's a great comparison.
Like
Yeah. The interesting aspect that came to mind with the duty is that set aside the feasibility of rescue, because I think that's an honest question. He, unlike R2, I think R2, couple great examples, but he was never atomized, sort of like IG-11 was. He had a proton bomb detonate in the middle of his chest. I was surprised, quite frankly, that any parts of him were still intact, but that's for the creators, not me. And so set aside the feasibility of whether when you came upon his parts, it was even possible. But if you determined pretty quickly that his memory circuits were damaged, that there were these issues, I would wonder whether that duty, any duty that did exist, would be offset by the potential foreseeable danger that might occur. You're rebuilding, after all, an assassin droid, and for all but a very, very few, they know him as just a killer, right? Or if they have knowledge of this type of droid, it's a murderous droid. It's good that it's in pieces. And so, would you be walking yourself into a situation where you're saving him or resurrecting him, so to speak, but you're walking right into a scenario in which many more lives are going to be endangered? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's interesting with regard to droid rebuilding knowledge.
Stephen, anything to add?
I would just kind of chime in just to say, or to observe, that his final wish, as they sort of showed in the beginning of the episode that last week, was that he can't be captured, so he must be destroyed. And so if he thought that his only alternative was to be captured or destroyed, those were his only alternatives, and he wished to be destroyed, it seems like it might be kind of overriding someone's like DNR provision in their final arrangements, which seems a little sketchy, but again, for the plot, it's great to have that droid back for sure.
I have the geeky tiki. Like, I'm very excited to have him back. Now, on that note, we have the big issue of trying to rebuild him. Did Grogu commit battery on that Anzellan with the no squeezy bad baby moment?
Oh my god, Bad Baby. That's the nickname of him around Grogu around our household, Bad Baby. So I was thrilled that he was called that on screen.
Yeah, I mean, it is an unwanted touching. Theoretically, Mando could be financially liable for tort committed by the child. It's just a big bear hug in comparison, but still, it's technically a battery.
Yeah, query how much a jury would award in damages. It might be very nominal, because who wouldn't want to be surprise hugged by Grogu?
That's true. Although, given his history, are we sure that it was going to stop with a hug?
Started with a hug, maybe a little nibble.
He didn't look like a snack. Like this week, he wasn't a frog. This seemed to be, he's not a pet. So there's that. Pivoting to the pirate cowboy moment, where we have High Noon in the streets with High Magistrate Grieve Karga getting into a gunfight, and which looks like a duel that is initially non-fatal. because Grief shoots the gun out of the pirate's hand. Was he right to engage in that fight outside the school with the pirates who wanted the school to turn back into a bar? Stephen, your thoughts?
Yeah, that seemed like kind of a big public safety issue, especially if they're actually outside of a school and weapons are being brandished. It seems like the law enforcement would, of course, in our culture of very scary situations involving schools and guns, sort of a touchy subject. But yes, I would say that law enforcement would need to handle that swiftly and decisively.
Tom, your thoughts?
Yeah, the Nikto there, Vane, I think he presented a real threat. He was not backing down in spite of the clear knowledge that that was a school he was trying to enter, and it seemed like we've just seen the tip of the iceberg in terms of the thorn in the side that these pirates represent for Navarro and its rebuilding efforts. And I think Grief knew a lot more than we as the audience did, and quite frankly, I it's unclear to me what kind of law enforcement presence they have on the planet. He had just gotten done with trying to sell Mando on coming to the planet to do just that. So it seems like they're in need of assistance, and Grief is having to do some of that work himself. So I think he was entirely reasonable. I think he actually showed a lot of restraint in how he handled the situation.
He did a fair amount of de-escalation, trying to diffuse it and get them to leave. I'm sure he had really good stuff back at the office. Like there could have been a peaceful resolution to this where no one died and these guys were being jerks. And if they had entered the school armed, what kind of bad things would have happened? So I think Grief was right. I think the pirate escalated, which then turns to the issue of the pirates now disarmed. The other four decide to draw their weapons, and that's when Mando shoots each one at a time in rapid succession. I think that's a justified use of force because they were ready to use lethal force with their weapons. And I think he was right to draw and fire. Either of you disagree or want to concur in my analysis?
My no sentence concurring opinion.
Yeah, per curiam. Yeah, we don't want to sign it, but we'll
shadow docket.
For sure. Yeah, that was a pretty cold-blooded, but it seemed like that was a really risky situation if there's children nearby, for sure.
I mean, it's asking a lot for Mando. Shoot all of the guns out of their hands. Like, no. I mean, granted, apparently no one has a stun setting. That could have been a, Bad Batch, we have stun left and right. Apparently Mando doesn't have a taser. So, yeah. Now, going to the issue of how a society functions, Navarro is a really neat view on if the original version of it from season 1 was like unregulated, libertarian, it's just the law of the gun. It's dark and scary because the only law is lethal force. You then have a government form that Grief is running. And with the government comes some regulation and safety and public welfare. And it allows business to thrive, which then allows the economy to blossom. And you have a regulated free market that has definitely at least had law enforcement, which is part of the equation. The other part is having a court system that works. So that way you have law and law enforcement working together to make sure people are safe. Right now, it's open question on what kind of law enforcement is in place. And that big tract of land probably could be a nice, happy home for all those Mandalorians looking for a place to live. So there could be a really nice synergy if they put that together with why live by the scary kaiju when you could have this? And you got guys who do law enforcement and kids who can grow up with not getting shot at. Everything could work out well. So I don't know if that's the plan, but it's a problem if they got pirates in orbit near the miners in the asteroid belt. So that does seem future problems.
I will note before we leave the planet of Navarro, we don't have enough facts to go on to provide much analysis here, but we have yet further confirmation that the New Republic is engaged in ongoing war crimes tribunals for former Imperials. And I thought that was not the first time that it was mentioned. I think we first heard of a tribunal on screen in Book of Boba Fett, but now we know where Moff Gideon was sent to, and Mando suggests he could be executed or face capital punishment for crimes against Mandalore. You know, the direct connection there being sort of the real world grave breach of genocide or just mass murder in general.
Well said. Yeah, and I have a feeling we haven't heard the end of that. So
I hope not.
I know again, they have to be writing for us. They have to be thinking there are lawyers who like this. This is for them. We want the lawyers to tune in and care about this. Which then brings us to going to visit Bo-Katan, who's what, 65?
She looks amazing.
Yeah.
She's got a great wig this season too. She's definitely had a wig upgrade, which is
Yes.
She's the same age as Obi-Wan Kenobi. People should not forget that of, maybe some species age differently, but I mean, environment plays a factor. She's in a nice castle as opposed to Tatooine. Yep. But she's like pushing 65.
Clean living.
Probably
that Mandalore way.
Yeah.
It happens when you bathe in the waters beneath the mines of Mandalore. It's very rejuvenating.
It's like Lake Minnetonka. So, but the section that I just want to call strange women living in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government, because leadership should not be determined by the Darksaber. And the fact that she didn't get it, and she's now back at her castle being very cranky about the fact that everyone abandoned her because she didn't have the Darksaber. It's like really not planned. It's not a good system of governance. Your legitimacy should come from the consent of the governed, not I got the magic sword, or I killed the dude and got the magic sword. Like, that's the situation that she's in. It doesn't seem like a good system of government.
Can either of you refresh my recollection? Was Satine, was she a democratically elected leader of Mandalore? Did she didn't really have the Darksaber, did she?
No, she did
Satine never did.
Yeah.
No.
Huh.
That was part of the reforms that they had, showing that, it was a diverse population, that there were those who went away from everyone's armed, living in the capital, to it looked like Coruscant with people going about their daily business. And then you had, the Night Watch doing their thing. Death Watch, pardon me. Mm-hmm. Death Watch. I get confused with all the watches. Because there's got to be a Night Watch somewhere now too. So
I'm the watcher on the wall. Wrong.
We're crossing the streams.
Yeah,
there's too much there. And other Disney properties. So yeah, there's a lot. She's cranky and tells Din, you go wave around the Darksaber and they'll follow you, which could be his call to a hero's journey for him to become the leader. So like that actually could be his destiny, or it's something completely different with maybe some reforms are going to kick in. but she's quite upset that she's not in charge.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because he attempted to transfer legal ownership of he just attempted to give it to her, and that's not the deal. That's not the way it works. It has to be, I guess, one in combat, which is odd because I think if my memory from Rebels serves me, I don't think Sabine lost it in combat to her. She just gave it to her, and there's that great scene where she hoists it above the fighters. But yeah, that's clearly a central issue here, and wonder if like Mando couldn't just take a dive to a stormtrooper, not be really hurt, and like, but the stormtrooper gets hold of the Mandalore or the Darksaber, like technical compliance with the rule, and then Sabine or Bo-Katan can come in and make quick work of the stormtrooper, and all is right in the world.
Yeah, there's
This is why lawyers don't write this show, because it's like, why can't we just do that?
okay, because Sabine got the Darksaber on Dathomir and Maul's lair, so there was no combat involved other than maybe the witches that were like ghosts that were trying to possess them. And then after getting to the Mandalorian moon where her family was, Sabine gave it to Bo-Katan pre-Battle of Yavin. So Katan never got it from combat. It was gifted to her once, and apparently that's a curse. And she then, however, it's lost to Gideon, is not ever explained. And here we are. So she's pouting in her castle.
Looking amazing doing it. I want to sit like that. Can I pull that off?
Just
Like...
For all future podcasts, I'm just going to be like slumped into this chair.
Yeah, it's just like, is it comfortable like that? Are you stretching out? Is that trying to look regal? I like, is that even comfortable? I mean, it's like, we practice on your couch.
Yeah, she's just giving me like despondent ruler vibes, very Hamlet, like draped over her throne.
Take your sword and leave me.
Just
Take your leave.
Just listening to goth music and writing mean poetry. Like she's not happy. And apparently there's like a droid or two to keep her company. So yeah, it's Depression City right there.
She is sulking for sure.
Yeah. I don't think that means she'll be the antagonist of the story, but she needs to get out of her funk and get with the action. So but again, will Mando lead? Is this his call to action to be something greater than what he currently is? Because he accepted fatherhood. Like, is this the next step for, now we'll get everyone to play nice? We'll lead all these coverts and we'll go retake the planet. And if it's empty, that's an easy retake. You got to rebuild.
We won.
You're not kicking an invader out. This is home now. We got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, a lot of issues upcoming, I think, when it comes to environmental cleanup and super funds, and get ready to research.
Yeah, it's like, what resources are accessible so you can have a thriving economy. And again, Tom, do you know how many moons there are that
In
are,
the man?
yeah, that are habitable, that could have a
No.
function? Okay. Because that's an interesting question. Like, wasn't the mining guild active near there in Rebels? Because that could, again, things that
Could have
could be a
been.
source of income. So it helps to have an economy to rebuild.
This is true.
I mean, I don't think the New Republic's going to launch a Marshall Plan for them, but if they have a form of income, they can get out of the mess. So anyway, that's all we got for this. We need to talk Bad Batch and some other shows. But everyone, first, anything for the good of the order before we call it quits tonight?
I've got an early morning tomorrow with more Mandalorian and more Bad Batch. So
Something to look forward to.
yeah.
Just to circle back to the beginning of our conversation when I was waxing poetic about the Galactic Star Cruiser, there were two things in this week's episode that made us do the Leonardo DiCaprio pointing meme. The first was the Purrgil and the Halcyon.
Yes.
The Halcyon is a Purrgil class cruiser.
Oh, nice.
So I got to point that out. And then the other thing was that Shug Drabor, who is the designer of the Halcyon, was an Anzellan. And
Nice.
on the Galactic Star Cruiser, there's a very tiny, like 1 foot tall door set into the wall at the floor in one of the stairwells. And so Eric saw that. He was like, "Hey, wait a minute. That's like on the Star Cruiser." I was like, "Yeah, Anzellans."
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yep, there's a lot of crossover.
Very cool.
Wow. I was happy to see the Purrgil. Really happy.
Yeah, that was cool, right?
Yeah.
And to make it look like hyperspace is a big ocean, even better.
Super
Yeah.
cool.
So with that, everyone, I'm a grateful nerd and very happy you could all geek out with us tonight and talking about Mandalorian. So wherever you are, please leave a review on whatever application you enjoy us on. And until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay geeky.